Picture this. A 13-year-old girl stands before the most powerful empire in human history. Her small hands tremble, not from fear, but from the cold stone beneath her feet. The year is 304 AD, and the Roman Empire spans 3 continents, commanding legions that have conquered nations. Emperors live like gods. Their word is absolute law, and their displeasure means death. Yet here she stands, this child barely old enough to understand love, refusing to bow to their demands. Her name is Lucia, and in the next few hours, she will endure tortures so brutal that grown men would break before the first one ended. But this isn't just a story about suffering. It's about the moment when an ordinary girl became extraordinary, when faith proved stronger than fear, and when the mightiest empire on earth met something it couldn't conquer. An unbreakable spirit. What you're about to read will challenge everything you think you know about courage, pain, and the human capacity to endure. This is the true story of how a 13-year-old girl faced 13 different tortures and emerged victorious in ways the Romans never expected. Before she became a saint, before she became a symbol, Lucia was simply a girl growing up in Syracuse, a bustling port city in Sicily. The Mediterranean sun warmed the cobblestone streets where she played, the same streets where Roman soldiers marched in perfect formation. It was a world where 2 realities existed side by side: the comfortable life of Roman citizens and the underground network of early Christians. Lucia's family was wealthy by any standard. Her father had been a successful merchant before his death, leaving behind estates, servants, and enough gold to ensure his daughter would never want for anything. Her mother, Eutychia, was respected in Syracuse society, known for her charity work and her careful navigation of the political landscape that kept their family safe. But wealth couldn't protect them from everything. Eutychia suffered from a bleeding disorder that no physician could cure. For 4 years, she had grown weaker, spending fortunes on doctors who promised relief but delivered only disappointment. The bleeding sapped her strength, turned her complexion pale as marble, and filled her nights with pain that even the strongest wine couldn't numb. It was during this time of family crisis that Lucia first encountered something that would change her life forever: Christianity. Unlike the distant Roman gods who demanded elaborate ceremonies but offered little comfort, the Christian faith spoke of a God who suffered alongside humanity, who promised hope to the desperate and healing to the broken. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For months, Lucia attended secret gatherings in hidden rooms and underground chambers, listening to stories of Jesus Christ that contrasted sharply with everything Roman culture taught about power and divinity. Where Rome preached strength through conquest, Christianity taught strength through service. Where Roman gods were distant and demanding, the Christian God was described as loving and accessible. The moment that sealed her conversion came during a pilgrimage to the tomb of Saint Agatha in nearby Catania. Lucia had convinced her mother to make the journey, hoping for divine healing. As they prayed together at the martyr's shrine, something extraordinary happened. Not just to her mother, but to Lucia herself. "I felt," she would later tell the interrogators, "as if a fire had been lit inside my chest, not painful like fever, but warm like coming home after being lost in winter." Her mother's bleeding stopped that very day, and Eutychia rose from the tomb of Saint Agatha with color returned to her cheeks and strength in her limbs. The miracle confirmed what Lucia had been feeling for months. This faith was worth everything, even life itself. She made a vow that would seal her fate. She would dedicate her life, her body, and her future to Christ. She would never marry, never bear children, never live the comfortable life her wealth could provide. Instead, she would give everything to help the poor, the persecuted, and the suffering. It was a decision that would put her on a collision course with the most powerful empire in the world. Lucia's newfound devotion to Christianity created an immediate problem: her engagement to a young Roman nobleman. The arrangement had been made years earlier, a business transaction disguised as romance that would unite two wealthy families and secure Lucia's future in Syracuse society. The nobleman, whose name history has mercifully forgotten, represented everything the Roman upper class valued: ambition, political connections, and an unwavering loyalty to the emperor. He was handsome in the way statues are handsome, perfect features carved from marble, impressive to behold but cold to the touch. Their marriage would have been spectacular by Roman standards. A 3-day celebration featuring gladiator games, theatrical performances, and enough wine to supply a small army. But Lucia no longer wanted any of it. The wealth that once seemed like security now felt like chains. The social status that once brought pride now seemed hollow. The marriage that once represented her future now appeared to be a betrayal of everything she had come to believe. When she finally told her fiancé that she was breaking their engagement, his reaction revealed the true nature of their relationship. This wasn't a man heartbroken by lost love. This was a businessman furious about a broken contract. The dowry he had been promised, the social connections he had been expecting, the alliance with Lucia's family that would advance his political career. All of it vanished with her decision. "You're throwing away everything," he raged during their final meeting. "Your family's honor, your future, your place in society. And for what? To worship a dead Jewish carpenter with a handful of slaves and beggars." Lucia's response was delivered with the calm certainty that would later infuriate Roman magistrates. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing something better." What happened next reveals the petty vindictiveness that often motivated religious persecution in the Roman Empire. Unable to change Lucia's mind through argument or threats, her former fiancé chose revenge. He knew exactly how to hurt her in the most devastating way possible. By reporting her to the authorities as a Christian. The denunciation wasn't just an act of spite. It was a calculated move in a larger political game. Emperor Diocletian had recently issued the most severe anti-Christian edicts in Roman history, promising rewards for citizens who exposed hidden believers and threatening punishment for those who protected them. By reporting Lucia, her former fiancé could present himself as a loyal citizen while destroying the woman who had humiliated him. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the real story. A girl who had chosen faith over fortune was being destroyed by a man who valued fortune over everything else. But in the Roman Empire of 304 AD, irony was a luxury few could afford to notice. When the soldiers came to arrest her, Lucia was distributing food to Christian families hiding in the catacombs outside Syracuse. She could have run. She had enough money to buy passage to Egypt or Gaul, enough connections to disappear into any number of safe houses. Instead, she calmly finished handing out the last of the bread she had brought and turned to face the men who had come to take her to trial. "I've been expecting you," she told the captain of the guard, and the simple dignity in her voice unsettled him more than tears or protests would have. The courtroom of Paschasius, the Roman governor of Syracuse, was designed to intimidate. Massive columns supported a ceiling painted with scenes of Roman military victories. Statues of emperors lined the walls, their stone eyes seeming to watch every word spoken. The governor's chair was elevated on a platform that required visitors to look up when addressing him, a constant reminder of the power differential between Roman authority and everyone else. Lucia entered this theatrical display of imperial power wearing a simple white tunic, her hair uncovered, her hands bound with iron chains that seemed absurdly heavy for someone so young. If the Romans expected a frightened child who would crumble under the weight of their authority, they were about to be disappointed. Paschasius was a career bureaucrat who had spent decades climbing the ranks of Roman administration. He was known for his efficiency in handling problem cases, Christians, political dissidents, and other threats to imperial stability. His approach was usually pragmatic. Offer a reasonable compromise, apply just enough pressure to secure compliance, and move on to the next case. Most prisoners preferred this approach to the alternatives. But Lucia wasn't most prisoners. "You stand accused of practicing the illegal religion of Christianity," Paschasius began, consulting a scroll that contained the formal charges. "You are also accused of refusing to honor the gods of Rome and rejecting the authority of our divine emperor. How do you answer these charges?" Lucia's response was delivered with a clarity that surprised everyone in the courtroom. "I am a Christian. I worship Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all creation, including this empire. As for your gods and your emperor, I honor them as I would honor any other created things, with respect for their place in God's creation, but not with worship that belongs to God alone." The answer was legally problematic for several reasons. First, it was a clear admission of guilt to the primary charge. Second, it contained language that could be interpreted as treasonous. Questioning the divine status of the emperor was a capital offense. Third, it demonstrated that Lucia understood the legal and theological implications of her position, making it impossible for Paschasius to dismiss her as a confused child who didn't understand the seriousness of her situation. What followed was perhaps the most remarkable courtroom exchange in the history of Christian persecution. Rather than immediately imposing sentence, Paschasius attempted to engage Lucia in a theological debate that he was confident he would win. He had studied philosophy at the best schools in Rome, had participated in discussions with the empire's finest legal minds, and had successfully argued dozens of similar cases. "Your Christ," he said with the condescending tone professors use with slow students, "was executed as a criminal by Roman justice. If he were truly divine, how could mortal men have killed him?" Lucia's answer revealed a theological sophistication that shouldn't have been possible for someone her age. "He died because he chose to die, not because you had the power to kill him. His death was victory disguised as defeat, life disguised as death. You think you understand power because you can hurt people's bodies, but you have no power over what really matters." The debate continued for hours, with Paschasius growing increasingly frustrated by his inability to shake Lucia's composure or confuse her reasoning. Every philosophical trap he set, she avoided with ease. Every logical contradiction he presented, she resolved with calm explanation. Every threat he made, she acknowledged without fear. Finally, Paschasius reached the conclusion that many Roman officials reached when dealing with committed Christians. This person was too dangerous to be allowed to live. Her calmness in the face of imperial authority was potentially infectious. Her reasoned defiance could inspire others to similar acts of rebellion. Her very existence challenged the foundation of Roman society, which depended on the absolute authority of the emperor and the state. "Since you refuse to honor the gods," he announced, "you will be taken to a house of prostitution where you will be forced to serve until your body is completely defiled. Perhaps when you have lost the purity you value so highly, you will reconsider your foolish beliefs." The sentence was calculated to break Lucia in multiple ways. Physical violation would destroy the bodily integrity that Christians believed was essential to spiritual purity. Public shame would eliminate any possibility of martyrdom being seen as heroic. The ongoing nature of the punishment would provide multiple opportunities for her to renounce her faith and secure her release. But once again, Paschasius had underestimated his opponent. Lucia's response to this sentence would become the foundation of her legend. "You cannot defile a body when the spirit remains pure. My body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, and no action you force upon it can change that reality." What happened next would astonish everyone present, including the soldiers who had seen everything the empire could offer in terms of human cruelty and resilience. The Roman soldiers who came to drag Lucia to the brothel were experienced professionals. They had moved prisoners, willing and unwilling, hundreds of times. They understood leverage, momentum, and the basic physics of moving human bodies from one place to another. What they encountered when they tried to move Lucia challenged everything they thought they knew about how the world worked. She simply couldn't be moved. It started as an amusing challenge. Lucia was small even for a 13-year-old, probably weighing less than most Roman soldiers' armor. The two guards assigned to escort her grabbed her arms and began walking toward the door, expecting her to follow. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, her feet planted on the marble floor as if they had grown roots. "Move," commanded the senior guard, applying enough pressure to force compliance from any normal person. Lucia didn't move. More guards were called. 4 men, then 6, then 8 surrounded the small girl and attempted to physically lift her from the courtroom floor. She remained motionless, not straining against them, not fighting, simply immovable in a way that defied every law of physics they understood. Someone suggested ropes. Heavy chains were brought, wrapped around her waist and legs, and attached to a team of oxen that could normally pull loaded wagons up steep hills. The oxen strained, the chains grew taut, the wooden floor began to crack under the pressure. But Lucia remained exactly where she was. By now, word of the spectacle had spread throughout Syracuse. Citizens gathered outside the courthouse, Roman officials arrived to witness the impossible, and even Paschasius himself came down from his elevated platform to observe the phenomenon firsthand. "What sorcery is this?" he demanded, though his voice carried more confusion than anger. Magic was a familiar concept in Roman culture, but this didn't follow any of the patterns Roman authorities had learned to recognize and counter. Lucia's explanation was characteristically direct. "This is not sorcery. This is the power of the Holy Spirit, demonstrating that God's strength is greater than yours. You cannot move me because God does not will me to be moved." The standoff continued for hours. Engineers were consulted about pulley systems. Philosophers debated whether they were witnessing natural or supernatural phenomena. Physicians examined Lucia to determine if some physical condition could explain her immobility. All the while, Lucia remained calm, occasionally speaking to the growing crowd about her faith, explaining Christian theology with the patience of a teacher and the authority of someone who had experienced divine power firsthand. Her composure in the face of impossible circumstances began to have exactly the effect Paschasius had feared. People started listening to her message. Finally, Paschasius realized that allowing this demonstration to continue was undermining Roman authority more effectively than any military defeat. If citizens began to believe that divine power could neutralize imperial force, the entire structure of Roman governance would be threatened. "If we cannot move her," he announced, "then we will destroy her where she stands." The decision to begin torturing Lucia in the courtroom itself represented a significant departure from Roman legal procedure, but Paschasius was no longer concerned with procedure. He was fighting for the credibility of the empire itself, and desperate situations called for desperate measures. What followed would test the limits of human endurance and challenge every assumption about pain, power, and the strength of the human spirit. The first torture was fire. Roman soldiers piled wood around Lucia's feet, soaked it with oil, and lit a blaze that should have consumed her within minutes. The flames rose high enough to singe the hair of men standing several feet away. The heat was so intense that spectators had to move back to avoid being burned themselves. Lucia stood in the center of the inferno without even perspiring. The wood burned to ash around her feet. The oil was consumed by flames that danced around her like decorative lighting. Her clothing remained untouched. Her skin showed no signs of burning, and she continued speaking to the crowd about the love of Christ as if she were standing in a pleasant garden rather than the middle of a bonfire. The impossibility of the situation drove Paschasius to escalate rapidly. If fire couldn't break her, then perhaps more direct physical trauma would succeed where flames had failed. The second torture involved boiling oil. Roman engineers constructed a small furnace in the courtroom, heated oil to temperatures that would have melted metal, and poured it over Lucia's hands and feet. The oil hissed and bubbled against her skin without leaving a mark. The third torture was molten lead. Heated to the point where it glowed white-hot, it was applied to her face and arms. Lucia continued speaking, her voice unchanged, her features unmarked. By now, the crowd outside the courthouse had swelled to include hundreds of people. Word was spreading throughout Syracuse and the surrounding region that something unprecedented was happening. Romans who had never questioned imperial authority were beginning to whisper about divine intervention. Christians who had been hiding their faith for years were openly weeping at the display of God's power. Paschasius, desperate to regain control of the situation, ordered increasingly creative forms of torture. The fourth involved iron hooks that were supposed to tear flesh from bone. The hooks bent and broke against Lucia's skin without penetrating it. The fifth torture was the rack, a device designed to slowly dislocate every joint in the human body. The mechanism strained to its breaking point without causing Lucia any apparent discomfort. The sixth involved wild animals brought from the arena, lions, bears, and wolves that had been starved to increase their aggression. The beasts approached Lucia, sniffed her hands, and lay down at her feet like domesticated pets. Each failed torture attempt increased the crowd's amazement and Paschasius's desperation. The seventh torture involved poison that should have killed her within minutes. The eighth was suffocation using techniques that had never failed to break a prisoner's will. The ninth combined multiple forms of physical trauma simultaneously. None of them had any effect. By the time they reached the 10th torture, Paschasius was no longer trying to force Lucia's conversion. He was fighting for his own credibility, his career, and his understanding of how the world worked. If Roman authority couldn't break a 13-year-old girl, what did that say about the empire's claims to power? The 10th torture was psychological rather than physical. They brought her mother, Eutychia, into the courtroom and threatened to execute her unless Lucia renounced her faith. For the first time since the ordeal began, Lucia showed signs of emotional distress. "My mother," she said, her voice trembling for the first time, "has already been healed by God's power. If it is God's will that she join me in martyrdom, then we will both count it as honor. If it is God's will that she live, then no power you possess can harm her." Eutychia, displaying courage that matched her daughter's, spoke directly to Paschasius. "My daughter has shown me the power of the true God. I would rather die with her in truth than live with you in lies." The psychological torture had backfired, providing Lucia with support rather than breaking her resolve. Paschasius, running out of options and facing a crowd that was increasingly sympathetic to the girl he couldn't break, decided to attempt the most direct approach possible. If he couldn't force her to move, couldn't burn her, couldn't poison her, and couldn't break her spirit, then perhaps he could at least silence the voice that was converting his citizens with every word she spoke. The 11th torture was designed to be the most pragmatic. They would cut out her tongue. If Lucia couldn't speak, she couldn't continue preaching to the crowd that had gathered to witness her ordeal. Without her voice, she would become just another failed execution, a curiosity rather than a threat to Roman authority. A soldier approached with a sharp knife, freshly heated to cauterize the wound and prevent her from bleeding to death too quickly. The crowd fell silent, understanding that they were about to witness something that would either end this remarkable demonstration or escalate it beyond anything they could imagine. The knife sliced through Lucia's tongue cleanly, and the soldier held up the severed organ as proof that this, at least, had worked according to plan. He threw the tongue onto the courtroom floor, where it lay in a pool of blood that should have been flowing from Lucia's mouth. But there was no blood, and when Lucia opened her mouth to speak, Her voice was as clear and strong as it had been before the mutilation. "You think you can silence the word of God by cutting human flesh?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the courtroom and beyond. "The Spirit of God speaks through me, and no knife can cut the Spirit." The 12th torture combined desperation with spite. Unable to affect her physically or silence her voice, Pascasius ordered her eyes to be removed. If she couldn't see the crowd, perhaps she wouldn't be able to address them so effectively. If she was rendered helpless and disfigured, perhaps the people would lose their fascination with her apparent invulnerability. The procedure was carried out with surgical precision by a physician who had experience treating battlefield wounds. Both eyes were removed completely, leaving empty sockets that should have rendered Lucia blind and helpless. Instead, she looked directly at Pascasius and said, "My eyes see more clearly now than they ever have. I see the glory of God, the foolishness of your empire, and the fear in your heart. Physical sight is nothing compared to the vision God gives to those who serve him." The crowd was beyond amazement now. They were witnessing something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Roman civilization. If imperial power couldn't break a child, if Roman authority couldn't silence a teenager, if the mightiest empire in history couldn't overcome the faith of a single girl, then perhaps everything they had been taught about power and weakness needed to be reconsidered. Pascasius, faced with the complete failure of everything he understood about control and coercion, made a decision that revealed more about his character than any of his previous actions. The 13th torture wasn't designed to break Lucia or convert her or even silence her. It was designed to satisfy his need for revenge against someone who had made him look powerless in front of his own citizens. He ordered a sword to be thrust through her throat. The sword entered Lucia's throat with the precision of an executioner who had performed this task hundreds of times. It should have severed her vocal cords, her windpipe, and the major arteries that supplied blood to her brain. It should have killed her within seconds and finally ended the demonstration that had paralyzed Roman authority for an entire day. Instead, Lucia continued speaking. With a Roman sword protruding from her neck, she addressed the crowd that had gathered to witness her ordeal. Her voice remained strong, clear, and completely unaffected by the blade that should have made speech impossible. "See how desperately they fight against the truth," she said, gesturing toward Pascasius and his soldiers. "They have exhausted every form of torture they know, and still God's power protects his servants. This is not because I am special, but because God's love is stronger than their hatred." She turned to address the Christians who had been hiding in the crowd, afraid to reveal their faith. "Do not fear these men who can hurt your bodies but cannot touch your souls. God's protection is real. God's love is stronger than their power, and God's kingdom will outlast their empire." Finally, she spoke directly to Pascasius. "I forgive you for what you have done today. You acted from fear and ignorance, not from evil. When this empire falls and these statues crumble and these laws are forgotten, the love of Christ will still be transforming lives. I pray that you will understand this before it is too late." The sword remained in her throat for 3 hours while she continued preaching, teaching, and explaining Christian theology to anyone who would listen. Roman soldiers stood guard around a girl they couldn't kill, listening to words they couldn't silence, witnessing power they couldn't understand or counter. When Lucia finally died, it was not because Roman torture had broken her, but because she chose to release her spirit to God. Her last words were a prayer of gratitude. "Thank you, Father, for allowing me to show your people that your love is stronger than their fear. Receive my spirit, and use this moment to bring many more into your kingdom." The silence that followed her death was profound and transformative. For several minutes, no one in the courtroom moved or spoke. The reality of what they had witnessed was too overwhelming to process immediately. A 13-year-old girl had faced the full power of the Roman Empire and emerged victorious in every way that mattered. She had proven that faith could overcome force, that love could outlast hatred, and that some things were more powerful than the mightiest military machine in human history. The immediate aftermath of Lucia's martyrdom was chaos. Paschasius found himself facing a crowd of several hundred people who had witnessed his complete failure to break a child's faith. Roman authority, which depended on the perception of overwhelming power, had been revealed as helpless against something they couldn't see, touch, or destroy. Many of the soldiers who had participated in Lucia's torture refused to continue serving in Syracuse. Some requested transfers to distant provinces where they wouldn't have to face the questions that her martyrdom had raised. Others resigned from military service entirely, unable to reconcile what they had witnessed with their understanding of Roman power and authority. Paschasius himself never recovered from the experience. Historical records suggest that he spent his remaining years in increasingly desperate attempts to explain what had happened in his courtroom. He consulted philosophers, physicians, and religious experts from across the empire, but none could provide an explanation that satisfied his need to understand how his authority had been so thoroughly challenged by someone he should have been able to crush without effort. The Christian community in Syracuse was transformed overnight. Believers who had been hiding their faith for years began openly professing their beliefs. The underground network of Christian families became a visible church that met in public spaces rather than hidden rooms. The martyrdom of Lucia had provided proof that God's protection was real and that Roman persecution was ultimately powerless against genuine faith. But the impact extended far beyond Syracuse or even beyond the Christian community. Lucia's story spread throughout the Roman Empire with remarkable speed, carried by traders, soldiers, and travelers who had either witnessed the events themselves or heard first-hand accounts from people who had been present. In every telling, the same elements remained consistent. A young girl had faced 13 different tortures without being broken, had continued preaching while physically mutilated, and had demonstrated that some forms of power were stronger than military force. The details might vary slightly depending on the teller, but the core message remained unchanged. The story reached Rome itself within weeks of Lucia's death. Emperor Diocletian, who had initiated the persecution that led to her arrest, reportedly became obsessed with understanding how a child had defeated his empire's most sophisticated torture techniques. He demanded detailed reports from Syracuse, consulted with his most trusted advisors, and even considered sending investigators to verify the accounts. What disturbed Diocletian most wasn't the failure of torture to break Lucia's will. Stubborn prisoners were not uncommon. What troubled him was the failure of torture to affect her body. If the reports were accurate, then Christians possessed some form of protection that Roman authorities didn't understand and couldn't counter. If that protection was real, then the empire's entire approach to maintaining order might need to be reconsidered. The political implications were staggering. Roman governance depended on the credible threat of punishment for disobedience. If certain groups of people could neutralize that threat through supernatural protection, then the foundation of imperial authority was under attack in ways that military force couldn't address. Within a decade of Lucia's martyrdom, the great persecution initiated by Diocletian began to collapse under its own contradictions. The empire discovered that executing Christians often produced more Christians, that public tortures frequently resulted in public conversions, and that attempting to destroy a faith that promised eternal life often had the opposite effect of making that faith more attractive to people facing the uncertainties of mortal existence. Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 AD officially ended the persecution of Christians throughout the Roman Empire. While many factors contributed to this dramatic policy reversal, historians have noted that stories like Lucia's played a significant role in convincing Roman authorities that Christianity was too resilient to be eliminated through violence. The irony was profound. By trying to destroy Christianity through persecution, The Roman Empire had provided it with its most powerful evangelistic tool. Every martyrdom became a demonstration of faith's power over force. Every failed execution became evidence of divine protection. Every attempt to silence Christian voices resulted in more people wanting to hear the message that could inspire such courage. Lucia's story became central to Christian teaching about the nature of faith, suffering, and divine power. Her feast day, December 13th, became one of the most widely celebrated dates in the Christian calendar. Churches throughout the empire and beyond dedicated themselves to her memory, and her name became synonymous with courage in the face of persecution. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Lucia's legacy was its appeal beyond the Christian community. Even Romans who never converted to Christianity found themselves inspired by the story of a young girl who had faced impossible odds with unwavering courage. Her example resonated with anyone who had ever felt powerless against overwhelming authority, anyone who had ever wondered whether individual conscience could stand against institutional pressure. The Roman Empire that had tried to destroy Lucia lasted only another century and a half. The faith she died for has endured for nearly 2 millennia, outlasting not only the empire that persecuted it but dozens of other governments that have attempted to suppress it through force. Today, Lucia is remembered as Saint Lucy, patron saint of the blind and those who suffer from eye diseases, a title that takes on additional meaning when one considers that she continued to see clearly even after her eyes were removed. Her story is told in churches around the world, in languages the Romans never heard, to people living in countries the empire never knew existed. The story of Lucia raises questions that extend far beyond the boundaries of any single religious tradition. What does it mean for a child to possess such extraordinary courage? How do we understand suffering that seems to serve a purpose beyond the immediate pain it causes? What should we make of accounts that seem to violate the natural laws we use to understand the world? From a historical perspective, Lucia's story reflects the complex dynamics of cultural and religious conflict in the late Roman Empire. The persecution of Christians wasn't primarily theological, it was political. Christianity threatened Roman authority not because of its spiritual claims, but because it created loyalty to a power higher than the emperor. When Christians declared that Christ was Lord, they were implicitly denying that Caesar was Lord, and that denial struck at the heart of imperial ideology. Lucia's resistance to torture can be understood as the ultimate expression of this conflict. By demonstrating that Roman power couldn't break Christian faith, she was proving that the empire's claims to absolute authority were false. Her willingness to endure suffering rather than compromise her beliefs revealed that some people valued spiritual integrity more than physical comfort or social acceptance. From a psychological perspective, Lucia's story illustrates the extraordinary capacity of human beings to transcend their circumstances through the power of deeply held beliefs. Research into extreme stress situations has consistently shown that people who possess strong faith traditions, whether religious or secular, demonstrate remarkable resilience in the face of trauma that would break others. The specific details of Lucia's torture, the apparent immunity to fire, the ability to speak without a tongue, the continuation of sight without eyes, remain matters of interpretation. Believers see them as evidence of divine intervention. Skeptics suggest that the accounts may have been exaggerated over time, as often happens with stories that take on legendary status. But regardless of how one interprets the supernatural elements of the story, the core historical fact remains undisputed. A 13-year-old girl chose to die rather than renounce her faith, and her death inspired countless others to make similar choices. The power of that example transcends questions about the specific mechanisms of her resistance to torture. What makes Lucia's story particularly compelling is its demonstration that age doesn't determine courage. We often assume that wisdom and strength come with experience, that young people lack the moral foundation necessary to make life-altering decisions. Lucia challenges those assumptions by showing extraordinary maturity in her theological understanding, remarkable composure under extreme pressure, and unshakable commitment to principles that she had embraced despite their personal cost. Her story also raises questions about the nature of victory and defeat. By any conventional measure, Lucia lost her confrontation with Roman authority. She was arrested, tortured, and executed. She never saw her persecutors punished or her faith vindicated by external events. Yet her defeat became the foundation for a victory that outlasted the empire that killed her. This paradox, defeat that becomes victory, weakness that reveals strength, death that produces life, reflects themes that appear throughout human history whenever individuals have chosen principle over survival. Lucia's story belongs in the company of other accounts of moral courage that have inspired people across cultural and religious boundaries. When we strip away the theological debates and the supernatural claims, when we set aside questions about divine intervention and miraculous protection, we are left with an undeniable historical reality. A 13-year-old girl named Lucia faced the full power of the Roman Empire and refused to surrender her convictions. She could have chosen comfort over conviction. Her wealth could have bought her safety in any number of distant provinces. Her youth could have excused her from the adult responsibilities of religious commitment. Her gender could have provided protection under Roman laws that treated women as perpetual minors incapable of making binding legal decisions. Instead, she chose to stand for something bigger than herself, something worth more than safety, something that made her short life infinitely more meaningful than the long lives of her persecutors. The 13 tortures she endured, fire, boiling oil, molten lead, iron hooks, the rack, wild animals, poison, suffocation, combined trauma, psychological warfare, mutilation, blinding, and finally the sword through her throat, represent more than just a catalog of Roman cruelty. They represent the complete arsenal of techniques that powerful institutions use to break individual resistance. Yet each failed torture demonstrated that some forms of power are stronger than physical force, that some commitments run deeper than the fear of pain, and that some truths are worth defending regardless of the personal cost. Lucia's story continues to resonate 17 centuries after her death because it speaks to something universal in the human experience. We all face moments when we must choose between what is easy and what is right, between what others expect and what we believe, between the approval of our peers and the approval of our conscience. Most of us will never face torture or death for our convictions. But we all face smaller versions of the same choice that Lucia confronted. Will we compromise our deepest beliefs for temporary safety? Will we abandon our principles when standing for them becomes costly? Will we find the courage to be different when conformity would be easier? Lucia's answer to these questions echoes across the centuries with startling clarity. At 13 years old, she understood something that many adults never grasp: that the things worth living for are also the things worth dying for, and that a life lived without conviction is barely a life at all. The Roman Empire that tried to break her spirit crumbled into dust. The emperors who demanded worship are remembered primarily for their failures. The soldiers who carried out their orders are forgotten entirely. But the girl they couldn't break, the child they couldn't silence, the teenager whose faith proved stronger than their fear, she is remembered not just as a saint, but as a symbol of everything that makes human beings capable of greatness. Her story reminds us that courage has no age requirement, that truth needs no army to defend it, and that the smallest person guided by unshakable principle can stand against the mightiest empire and emerge victorious in ways that matter most. The 13-year-old girl who faced 13 tortures and refused to break teaches us the most important lesson of all: that in the end, the only defeat that matters is the defeat of our own courage, and the only victory worth having is the victory of staying true to what we know is right, regardless of the cost. In a world that often seems dominated by force and fear, by those who mistake power for strength and volume for wisdom, Lucia's whispered truth still echoes with perfect clarity. You cannot touch what really matters. And 17 centuries later, she's still absolutely right. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane, untold historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, like, share, and comment below. What other untold historical story would you like me to reveal? See you in the next one.